Thank you very much. I don't know about you, but I'm inspired by this conference and by what Bonn is hosting us for. This is really remarkable. Let me first thank the Nordrhein-Westfalen government and GIZ for doing this. And what I find extremely exciting is that this is to be already pre-announced the first of a series of such conferences. I also think this is a fantastic venue. If I understand correctly, this was to be the Bundestag, is that right? And if I really understand correctly, I was sitting in the Chancellor's chair just a moment ago. I hope no impertinence there, but I was enjoying myself. That is the closest I will come, but I was enjoying it. I had my daughter take a picture of it so that we could remember that occasion. But it is symbolic for us, I think, of people power that we're here in this very special room. This is a kind of an assembly of civil society that is committed to making the kind of transformation that's needed. And I think, again, not knowing that I know exactly the story of this building, if I understand it correctly, it was built in the mid-1980s without anybody anticipating November 9, 1989, and what was to come with the fall of the Berlin Wall. That is, of course, a good, important lesson for us. That simple fact that we had no idea and could have no idea of one of the momentous turning points of modern history. I was at that point, actually, on that occasion 25 years ago, advising the Polish government already, which had gone through its revolution a few months before. There were several, well, every day was stunning that year, as people remember, but also utterly unpredictable. I'll tell you one little vignette of the unpredictability. It was early November. The wall had not fallen yet, and I was advisor in Poland, and I was passing through Prague on my way to Belgrade because there was already a lot of tumult, and I had been asked by the then Yugoslav federal government to come meet with them, and we stopped in Prague, which is my wife's birthplace, and we were meeting friends, and I was asked to go to what was called the Prognostication Institute. So it was the Institute of Prognostication of all places. And I met two economists that I did not know, and they led me to a back room, this being Czechoslovakia in pre-Velvet Revolution 1989, and we went to a back room and whispered for an hour. And it was really suspenseful and odd, and they asked me every detail about what was happening in Poland. And I explained what was happening with the Solidarity Revolution, and at the end I said, "When is it going to happen here?" And they said, "Oh, no, years." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, no, years away. Prognostication Institute. And we went to Belgrade, and it was a tumultuous week, to say the least, watching Berlin, and then the Velvet Revolution. And my wife and I were watching actually I remember watching the television, and I looked, so that's the guy that we met in Prague. And he was standing on the pedestal, 2 people down from Václav Havel. It turned out it was Václav Klaus, who became president afterwards. And the other person I met was a gentleman named Vladimir Dlouhý, who became Minister of Industry of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic. They had no idea a week before what was to come. Well, I wouldn't say that's all good news, but it sometimes is. It sometimes is awful news because we also know that events can happen that are devastating as well. What it does require, in my view, is that our eyes are, actually I have to tell you one more story. I only knew one person who got everything right in timing, and that was Adam Michnik, whom many of you will know was one of the great Polish patriots. And just to tell you, because some people can see, but most of us can't, I asked him in the summer that year, when will it happen in Czechoslovakia, especially because of my wife's relation to the country? And he said, before the end of the year, just like that. And I said, well, how do you know? He said, no, it's sure. I said, how do you know? He said, well, I was just in the mountains with Havel, it's all set. And that was true, by the way, but I didn't quite think it was as true as it turned out to be. For most of us and most of the time, we can't know. All we can know and what we can know is what should happen, and that's a should from a moral point of view. We can know what's important to happen. With technical knowledge, we can know what is possible to happen. And then I think our responsibility is, as moral agents, to help make what is possible actually happen. I don't think we can sit, and I've never found it very interesting in my own profession as an economist to be a forecaster. I'd be pretty miserable at it. Certainly if I bet my money investing, I would have lost it a long time ago. But I do think what we can do is to understand what is important and what's needed. And also with the sense that we have to have in history, in this country, absolutely, but it's true everywhere, we have to have a sense of the dangers that are always around us if we don't act with a moral commitment and with a clear vision and with taking every opportunity to make happen what can happen. And I think that that's really the spirit that I want to reflect on this year and on this challenge of sustainable development. We do have our backs to the wall. Don't ask me if it's going to be a good year of negotiations in the next 6 months or not. I don't know. And don't ask me whether we're going to achieve sustainable development, whether we're going to stay under the 2 degrees C upper limit on warming, whether we're going to end poverty by the year 2030, which we could do. I don't know. But what I do know is that those things are possible, and they're extraordinarily important. And I must say, in my own approach to these matters, a while ago, I stopped really asking the question, so you can discount everything else I'm going to say. I stopped asking the question of, will something happen? When Kofi Annan asked me to advise him on the Millennium Development Goals 15 years ago, I didn't ask, well, are they going to work? I just said, that's important to do. And strangely enough, because it's been a kind of burden on my back for a long time, or I could say black and blue marks from 25 years, when Mikhail Gorbachev asked me to help advise the Soviet Union and then Boris Yeltsin to advise the Russian government, I didn't ask whether this was likely to succeed or not. It's a good thing to ask, actually, if you want to notch up successes. But it's not necessarily the right question for us to ask about how we should behave. Because I do think, and I've always felt, that the right thing to do is to try to do the right thing. And that it's not so critical of whether we succeed or not. What's critical is that we're trying to do what is possible to do. And there, I do think that there are, I don't know, I've come back more and more as I've reflected on this to Aristotle and to Aristotle's idea of the 3 kinds of knowledge that he puts forward in the Politics, because I find it Very, very helpful. Aristotle says there are three kinds of knowledge that we need. One is what we would call scientific knowledge and what he called the episteme. And that would be understanding how the natural world works. So we better understand the climate science as best as possible. We better understand the dynamics of Earth system change. We better understand tipping points of ecological systems and so forth. Then the second kind of knowledge that Aristotle talks about is what he called techne, or what we would call technology, which is how to get from A to B. So it's a kind of conditional knowledge. How do you solve a problem? If you want to accomplish goal X, what are the ingredients to do it? What is a pathway from the present to where you want to go? The third kind of knowledge, to my mind, is the hardest and the one we don't practice very well these days, and that's what he called phronesis. And phronesis means, I'm not an expert on ancient Greek, but what I understand it to mean is practical wisdom, which is not understanding how to get from A to B, but to understand why B is important to get to. So it's a matter of choosing the ends, not the means to the ends. And Aristotle said if we can't have the practical knowledge, then we can have all of the technical skills we need, but we're not going to get to where we need to go. I do think our biggest opportunity and our biggest challenge is to combine the episteme, the techne, and the phronesis, that this is really what we're up against right now. And let me explain just in a couple of minutes. First, on the episteme. What do we know scientifically about the time that we're living in? We know that we're facing a problem that humanity has never faced before, and that is that we have global scale ecological or planetary boundaries that we have trespassed to the danger of the planet and to currently the most vulnerable people on the planet, who are the poorest people, and in the future to everybody. This is a unique challenge for our time. It's unique because we've never been so good at economic life, and we've never been so populous, of course, as we are in 2015. We are now a $100 trillion annual world economy. There are 7.3 billion people. The average production is about $13,000 when measured at what are called purchasing power adjusted international prices. What we can say is that that level of output of the world is about 100 times larger at a minimum than it was at the start of the industrial era 2 centuries ago. So the world economy has grown 100-fold, at least 2 orders of magnitude, and the size of the earth, precisely 0. So we uniquely have filled the planet with people, filled the planet with oil wells, filled the planet with 60,000 major dams on the river, filled the planet with arable land and pasture land from deforested regions, first in the temperate zones, now in the tropical zones. And we know that the key to economic growth from a market institutional sense has been basically unlocked, not for everybody, but for enough of the world, that the world economy is continuing to grow at a rate of about 3 to 4% per year, meaning a doubling period of about 20 years. So today's $100 trillion fairly robustly will be $200 trillion 20 years from now if we don't make disaster. But what we do know is that that 100 trillion today is ecologically destroying the foundations of the Earth's ecosystems, the climate system, the hydrologic cycle, the biodiversity. Never happened before. We were warned 40 years ago that it would happen, precisely 43 years ago, with Limits to Growth, an uncannily wonderful book. We were warned 23 years ago at the Rio Earth Summit. In fact, not just warned, we took decisions to do something about it. We're 23 years later, we've done nothing about it yet. Really nothing about it yet, I would say. So now our backs are to the wall. We really are the generation that faces this. The earlier generations could have headed off this more effectively, but we're now the generation that holds it in the hand because 100 trillion annual production, it's just too much for the planet to bear under our current technology. Greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise. Climate change continues to intensify. Water stress in many parts of the world continue to worsen through a combination of climate change, over-abstraction of groundwater, over-diversion of river flow through major dams and mega irrigation projects and urban settlements in places where they really shouldn't be, like much of the American Southwest, where we built up the fastest growing part of our country in the driest part of the country, and so forth. So that's what we can know epistemically. What about technically? What can we know? Here's the beauty. The beauty is actually, technically, there are solutions to these problems. They're not easy solutions at all, but there are solutions. The solutions are within grasp because we have gotten to the 100 trillion world economy by virtue of now 5 major waves of technological change. These are waves, the so-called long waves or Kondratiev waves, that reflect fundamental changes in basic technologies, starting with the steam engine and rail and the chemical industry, which so much came from Germany, and electrification and aviation and modern telecommunications. Now we're in the 5th great wave, which is really the computational and digital revolution era. My view is this is an absolutely fundamental revolution that we are experiencing that is profoundly significant. I prove it by saying that we've reached the highest level of civilization imaginable. We can stream a movie on our phones. How much better could you have? But even beyond that, we now have 7 billion people connected with mobile connectivity. We will have almost the whole world connected with broadband internet within the next few years. We have computational intelligence on any one of our phones that exceeds what NASA had available to put a man on the moon in 1969. We can have, as it's called, the Internet of Things soon enough that can do wonderful things for humanity. It makes possible the ability to leapfrog in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa where people had never stepped foot into a bank. They're banking routinely and regularly on their mobile phones. And of course, 5 or 10 years ago, much of rural Africa never had a phone, never made a phone call. And now it's ubiquitous. And this is having incredible, incredible benefit for people's lives. And the benefits that we can derive from this are profound with a little bit of attention, because it's now possible to bring modern healthcare at low cost almost anywhere, with smart systems, with telemedicine, with community health workers empowered by smart information technology. Any child in the world can have access to 100,000 free books online with a solar panel, a screen, and broadband. We barely use this so far, by the way, because that poor child doesn't live in a community with the funds to do it on their own, but if there was just a little bit of solidarity in the world system, we'd be able to ensure what we're about to promise with the Sustainable Development Goals, that every child should be able to complete a secondary education by 2030, universal coverage of at least through secondary education. All of these things, all of Aristotle's techne, the ability to go from A to B, are there. I think that our biggest challenge is really the third, knowing what we want. The phronesis, the ability to be wise, to have the sense of what's important. And there, I must say, we have some worries. I'm coming from the Vatican yesterday and going back to the Vatican tomorrow for meetings on these issues, and I find a great inspiration, I believe, for most or all of us. Pope Francis has put it more clearly and succinctly than anyone else in our time, and that is his statement in his exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, that we suffer from a globalization of indifference. And it's a paradox of our affluence. Here we are with the techne to solve all these problems, with the ability to find a robust food supply, healthy cities, low carbon energy, smart, clean vehicles, and all the rest. And what are we doing? What are we doing? We're stumbling around. We're not understanding what both the challenge that we face and our capacity to solve those challenges. We really are, in a way, morally without direction right now, and without the sense of where we could be going. I'll give an example from today's paper. President Obama is deeply committed to fighting climate change. We know that. He will sign an agreement in Paris at the end of this year. And yet yesterday, the administration opened up the Arctic for drilling, the US Arctic. It's incoherent. It's absolutely incoherent. It's literally incoherent in the sense that any serious study of the techne issue and the epistemic issue tell us we don't have enough room in the atmosphere to burn the conventional oil gas that we have, much less to start with the Arctic gas or the ultra-deep sea gas. A very fine paper in Science magazine earlier this year by a team at University College London, for example, showed in a very sophisticated global energy model that the first thing we need to do is leave the Arctic alone. That's carbon arithmetic, which is what the scientists tell us how to do. Our government doesn't do climate arithmetic, carbon arithmetic. In fact, I would venture to say the US government doesn't do arithmetic of almost any kind anymore. They hate spreadsheets. The whole idea that you look ahead, the word plan is evil in the US context. But I would classify that not as our incompetence, but as our lack of moral standing. Because these are people playing a role. They're not asking what's fundamentally important to do. And of course, the system lends itself to that, so it's an institutionalized globalization of indifference. A few weeks ago, a study came out, just to continue with this example, which is just the example of the day, because tomorrow I'd give you a different example. But a few weeks ago, a study was released by the Industry Advisory Committee to the Department of Energy in the United States. It's an industry committee that by law comes from the oil and gas industry and gives advice to the US government about these issues. I don't mind that at all, that industry would give advice, but it needs to be put in some context. Now, here was a 500-page report on the Arctic that did not have one paragraph about the climate implications of drilling in the Arctic. I looked up climate in the PDF, and the only part that climate came in was the difficulty that global warming meant that the ice was a little bit unstable for some of the machinery. I kid you not. But I would categorize that as a crisis of phronesis, not as a crisis of techne. And I can tell you that for sure because we had one of the world's greatest secretaries of energy, Stephen Chu, Nobel laureate. He could do a spreadsheet, ladies and gentlemen, but he wasn't allowed to. I think the political advisors spent most of their time agonizing that the US citizenry should never see Stephen Chu because he might say something true. And that could be a complication for campaign donations or for the next election, or could create something outside of the news cycle, and so on. So here we are, we're stumbling along. And that brings me to our possibility and what I hope we can do from here until the next time we meet at the Bonn Conference on Global Transformation, which I know will be at least within 2 years, maybe sooner. We have 3 big negotiations coming up in the next 7 months. In July, we have the Financing for Development Conference, which is to ask how do we finance sustainable development. That will be in Addis Ababa, July 13 to 16. Then we have the high-level summit on sustainable development at the United Nations, September 25 to 27. On September 25th, at 9 a.m. in the morning, Pope Francis will address probably 180 world leaders. That's going to be quite an occasion. And at the end of that day, governments will adopt sustainable development goals. Then, 5 weeks after that, or let's see, October, November, about 8 weeks after that, will be COP21 in Paris, which will be our last chance to keep the world below 2 degrees C. If COP21 in Paris ends like COP15 in Copenhagen, we're done. Many people say we're already done. They're wrong, because they haven't looked at the technique. They haven't looked at what's possible. They're making a forecast, but prognostication is hard. So you don't give up until it's not possible. And it's absolutely possible to live within 2 degrees C in a world of economic improvement. It just means deep decarbonization at a concerted rate. It means a global Energiewende that really gets done. It's feasible. So we'll have that last chance in Paris at the end of this year. I believe all 3 of these meetings are decisive for us. If we stumble badly in any of the 3, the whole edifice is going to be hard to hold up. Without financing, there can't be sustainable development goals, nor really a climate agreement. Without a framework of sustainable development, there can't really be a framework for decarbonization. Without decarbonization, sustainable development is impossible. And anybody who thinks, almost nobody does anymore, but some people say that the sustainability agenda is somehow against the poor. It's exactly the other way around. Unless we make the climate safe, the poor have no chance. They will be the first to lose everything. So we need to make all three of these work. I have one plea to government. Plea sounds like a pretty weak word. And one request of all of us. The plea to government is to take the goals that we'll set seriously. That's all. If we set a goal that every child should have access to secondary education, taking it seriously means having a plan to accomplish that, not just to announce a nice goal, but working out the modalities to make it happen. To have universal access to primary health care. It can be done. I know it can be done. I've seen it with my own eyes at small scale. How we can have effective low-cost health systems even in the poorest places in the world, if we try. But if you do such a plan, you find out it's not for free. It requires solidarity. It requires the rich helping the poorest of the poor. It requires benefactors, it requires foundations, philanthropists, governments, academia, businesses working together to do this. That's what taking the goals seriously means. And my request to all of us is that we act from that moral perspective. We will set goals this year. Don't let prognostication dissuade you, because the prognosticators don't know. Especially don't let cynicism overcome you. Cynicism is immoral, because cynicism is a guaranteed recipe for failure. I don't mean blind optimism, I mean considered optimism, that we know that if we work together, if we bear down, if we stay serious, if we stay focused, and if we stay together, this can happen. Thank you very much.